Major legislative activity in Virginia of historic proportions. A recent bill passed, the first of its kind in the United States, that outlines specifics on no-knock warrants served by police forces throughout the Commonwealth of Virginia. The catalyst and the leader on that bill is a historically Black college and university alumna, Delegate Lashresce. She represents Virginia's 63rd district and was the sponsor of this major historic legislation, not just for the Commonwealth, but for the United States, and on behalf of Black folks and better police relations in Black communities nationwide. So Delegate Aird, we are honored by your time here this morning.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the invitation. As you know, I am a proud Virginia State University Trojan, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Tell us about how, I think that it's pretty clear why you did this. And I think it's pretty clear the need for this, the Breonna Taylor bill, as it's been known nationwide. But how do you even get this started and start to galvanize the legislative support and the community support for a piece of legislation like this?
My life is one that began living through adverse circumstances. Having been raised in an urban community myself, well, multiple urban communities, and the unspoken tragedy of Breonna Taylor reminded me of those humble beginnings. It reminded me of what young Black and brown people, what young Black women endure on a regular basis, which is interactions with law enforcement that oftentimes can leave you feeling less than, and or in the case of Breonna Taylor, traumatized. This sort of unspeakable death, it touched me in such a way that was deeply personal. And at that time, I can remember vividly the work to try and get people to even say her name. It was right on the heels of the George Floyd tragic death. And the sister, the aunt, the mom, they were trying to get people to take note of what had occurred to Breonna Taylor. And so every single day it was say her name, say her name. And as a young Black woman, I thought that could be me. I am that young Black woman that we are constantly striving to get people to take note of and to pay attention to. And so that struck me in such a way from a deeply personal place. But furthermore, as I began to do research on the use of the no-knock search warrant, I was struck by the fact that going back to the Nixon administration decades ago in the 70s, this was always a problematic police tactic. When the no-knock search warrant was originally allowed, they came back and ceased its use after allowing it because of the way it was being employed. And at that time, it was dangerous to both law enforcement and communities that were coming in contact with law enforcement. And it was only until later on, as they continued the so-called war on drugs, that the tactic was allowed again. And there's no shortage of data to show that there have been other deaths, there have been other incidents, both to law enforcement and to individuals. And so that just it empowered me more to fight against the use of this search warrant.
That's a really unique point that you make, that it actually is a bill that when we hear it and we see it, and I think that we feel it, obviously honors Breonna Taylor and serves to protect, citizens. But there's an interesting point. You say we're working to protect police officers as well. We know that Virginia State, for example, has a great criminal justice history in Virginia and beyond. So can you talk a little bit about that? Was that part of constructing the bill, promoting the bill, working with communities, particularly in police forces, in the neighborhoods? Was that part of your kind of dialogue?
Absolutely. In fact, it's fascinating because when I began to lay the legislative groundwork, I thought, and in talking with stakeholders, this is going to be one of those bills where it allows advocates, activists, and law enforcement to come together and rally around an issue. And while it didn't exactly occur that way, I will say that the police department that actually oversees or works in conjunction with Virginia State University, which is the Chesterfield Police Department,
Mhm.
we actually found that that particular police department had not used no-knock search warrants in decades. And so that police chief was huge in helping us to get this legislation through because he said something that's critical, and I will forever keep this with me. He said that his philosophy as the police chief is that when their officers show up at the door of any person or engage with any person, they are supposed to extend the respect to that individual to decide how they want to interact with law enforcement. And it is only if an individual chooses to respond negatively that they then employ alternate tactics. But they at least owe it to the people they are engaging to respect them enough to allow them to choose. And that struck me because I don't think enough law enforcement entities adopt that model. Because you can't if you are saying you are okay with entering someone's home without their permission or awareness.
Talk about the legislative process on this. I think that a lot of folks don't know how it is to walk through a bill through a reading, committee review, all those kind of things. But skipping all of that, just the culture of the assembly
You
and
know,
the Commonwealth. What was that like getting advocates and supporters for it?
it was, I'm not gonna lie, it was a roller coaster ride. Most people will see the final outcome of the legislation and think, wow, you did that, that's great. And it was, look how easy it was for you to get that through Virginia. But it was not easy because the environment right now is such where any approach you try to take to change police practice is categorized as anti-police or is categorized and lumped into the whole defund the police movement, when quite frankly, this legislation had nothing to do with either of those things.
Mhm.
Because as you mentioned earlier, this actually helps protect police further. And so for the first time in my legislative history, I had another member on the other side of the aisle challenge me and call me a liar, made a really toxic environment around this legislation and tried to galvanize, other entities to basically call this legislation actually the opposite, endangering law enforcement. And so it was a really toxic and highly charged political environment. And the other, difficult part is I am in the House of Delegates. This legislation had to make it through the Senate, which is a far more moderate body. And we had to fight to not let the legislation get watered down and to keep it as a full prohibition and to even get some of the basic essentials like making sure an officer is in a uniform, making sure that a search warrant is executed in the daytime, those types of things. And so it was a real battle. But at the end of the day, because of the public pressure and the collaborative nature of this legislation, we were able to get it through.
You talked about some of the elements that were difficult to fight for, and you fought through that. Are there any parts of it that you wish you had more time or more latitude to include, or anything that you wished if other folks are entertaining this nationwide, and certainly they will because they've seen a sister push it through in Virginia, that you would advise them to say you might want to consider these parts as well?
I believe that we had great success with where we landed, but I do have one regret as it pertains to the final version for anyone who's thinking about pursuing this legislation in other states. There is a really important element that needs to be included. So the bill we passed outright bans the use of no-knock search warrants. It also requires that moving forward, any search warrant, the law enforcement entity has to audibly make themselves known, be in identifiable police uniform, only conduct that search during daylight hours. But we were unable to get a 30-second pause in the bill. And that means after law enforcement officers announce themselves and make themselves known, they would pause for 30 seconds. And that might sound like a long time, but it really isn't. But what it does is it allows those individuals on the other side of the door even a brief moment to take note that law enforcement is there, to gather themselves, and to make that decision about how they are about to respond and interact with law enforcement. And that's just so critical to prevent this simultaneous knocking, announcing, and entering, which is basically helps really get at the root of law enforcement entering your property without permission.
It's clear that you're passionate about this, that you see yourself in the story of Breonna Taylor. All of us do, who have sisters, aunts, mothers, friends, who are sisters. But talk about how you saw yourself in the Virginia State Assembly and how your Virginia State experience as a student, as an alumna, shaped your notion of I'm going to go to legislature and make a difference on behalf of our people.
I appreciate that because this session has felt like a culminating moment of my experience as a HBCU student. Oftentimes, or I can think back to when I first arrived at the General Assembly, and there was this attitude about an HBCU like VSU and the caliber of representative that you would be. In Virginia, you have two very large, predominantly white schools. And when you show up with orange and blue on and you ask, and they ask, what school is that? They call two other schools. They don't call the HBCU. But we have changed that since I've been in office. And Virginia State University has become a well-known, or further become a well-known and prominent name. But I say a culminating moment because when you think about the issues that impacts Black communities, urban communities, impoverished communities, there isn't always a voice for that. And I've been able to take my life's experience, my HBCU experience, and the experience of the community that I represent and elevate it in such a way that it's an everyday conversation. And there will never be another member in our body who can say they are unaware of or unsure of the needs of Black and Brown communities, and or communities particularly that surround, like Virginia State University here down in Ettrick and Chesterfield County. And so I carry all of that with me. I am showing that HBCU graduates can lead, HBCU graduates can govern, we can show up in any space, and we're going to show up prepared and able to get the job done. And when I think back to our Vice President-elect Kamala Harris and how people weren't quite sure how to talk about her HBCU experience, or how to talk about her as a Black woman leading, all of that is part of this journey, and all of that is important, not just for me as an individual, but for those who are coming after me.
What do you say to the students and potential students at HBCUs who look at you, and I'm talking about brothers and sisters, and say, well, dang, if she can do it, I can do it. What is the number one piece of advice that you would give to young people who are considering a career in political science and civil service, and say, you can do, if you start doing this now, maybe you can get to where I'm going or where I am? What's the number one thing that you would tell them to do to start now?
That is an interesting question. You can see the thinking on my face. There are so many parts and pieces to this journey. Well, first of all, I'm going to say you have to show up. I can recall giving opportunities to students who express an interest and desire to get to this place. But showing up means not just showing up to an event or a place, but it means showing up for yourself, working hard enough to hone in on your passions and your skills and your abilities, showing up enough to make the connections and build the network that you need to help support you, because you will need that to pursue any type of public office. And I'll even say leadership position. Showing up can mean, getting to know your community that you think you want to serve. But how can you serve if you don't truly know what people are experiencing and what their needs are? And showing up also means being your full and authentic self. There is no point in getting to this place to not be who you are, to not lean into our issues, and to not be authentically you. And so I would say for anyone who is thinking about doing this job, you need to have the hunger and the grit and the desire to show up in all of those ways.
And then the final question, have you had the opportunity, because we know that governance and lawmaking is nonstop. Even when you're out of session, you're still meeting with your constituents and you're still thinking about ways to improve their quality of life. Have you had the opportunity to really step back and think like, damn, I did that. Like I made a difference. I made some history, not just Virginia history, but some United States history. I did a good thing. And with all of the trouble that surrounded it, not just in the state house, but people in communities, have you had an opportunity to appreciate I did a big thing? I'm proud of myself.
It's hard. I have not. And I will be honest and transparent with you and say that it's naturally not my nature. Anyway, I'm one of those people where it's like, okay, that got done. And I'm looking at the list like, okay, what's next? What else do we need to get done? Right. And especially because I do feel like, wow, we have finally arrived at a moment where we can really get some things done because the atmosphere is right. And to be so fortunate to be here in this moment in time, I feel just especially privileged, because just last year we could have had this conversation and it would not have gone anywhere. Mm-hmm. And it has taken unthinkable tragedies to get us here. But while we're here, I am going to seize the moment in absolutely every way that I can. So I have not quite taken that step back to really, smell the roses and or get excited about what we've done, because there's still a lot of work to be done. There's still a lot of people who are in need and who are hurting. And I'm super fixated on that. But I appreciate the fact that people can see that we can get this work done if we continue to come together and work together. It's not an anomaly. It's not impossible. It can be done, and we will continue to do it.
Delegate Lashresce there, we appreciate you. We love you for your work. We appreciate your sacrifice in getting it done, and we look forward to the next big steps that you'll be taking and dragging us along with you to get done in the Commonwealth. Thank you so much.
Together. Thank you.